It might be helpful to just talk about a couple of nice examples of connected customer experiences. So let's maybe start out with one example from healthcare. As you probably know, non-adherence to medication is a key cost driver in healthcare systems around the world. So in the US alone, it has been estimated that $100 to $300 billion of avoidable healthcare cost can be attributed to non-adherence. And that's particularly problematic for long-term and chronic diseases where patients quite often are not always symptomatic, and so they're not always knowing what their needs is. So for instance, the World Health Organization has estimated that almost half of all prescribed medications for asthma is not being used. And of course that can lead to really costly emergency room visits, hospitalizations, and of course also emotional trauma, as many parents can attest with late night hospital visits for a child with an acute asthma attack, right? So no wonder many firms are trying to reduce these costs while providing more value to patients, right, via some sort of connected strategy. So one interesting example is the smart inhaler developed by a New Zealand company called Ethereum. So the smart inhaler is a Bluetooth-enabled sensor that wraps around the patient's existing inhaler. And so that device now sends information via an app to the patient, but also, for instance, to the parents, so they know whether their child has taken the asthma medication. And of course, it can send that information to healthcare professionals to really track medication adherence. But that's not all, right? It's not just a tracking device. Now, after learning sort of the average usage pattern of a patient, now the app can also send the patients reminders or alerts, for instance, if a dosage is missed. And over time, the app learns more about a patient and can start predicting when asthma might strike, sort of allowing really the patient to preempt attacks. Now, the device contains quite a number of sensors, and over time, because sensors' cost have come down, they've been able to embed more and more sensors on this device. And those sensors allow feedback to the user not only about whether the medication has been taken, but also about whether the inhaler has been primed correctly, for instance, and pointedly corrected inside the mouth to deliver the full dosage. Quite often, actually, there is misuse. And given its information on the whole population of users, Ethereum has now been able to provide valuable feedback to AstraZeneca, the maker of the inhaler, to redesign the inhaler so it is more likely to be used correctly. So we will talk much more about these sort of feedback loops later in our module on the repeat dimension. But as you can start to see, right, that information that we are gathering from that customer, we can help the customer, but we can also help sort of provide and create better products for the future. Now, another interesting example of creating a much deeper and more continuous connection with a customer is through wearable sensors. And there are lots and lots of wearable sensors out there. Again, just sort of one example of this is L'Oreal has developed a battery-free wearable sensor that measures individual UV exposure. So that sensor is less than 2 millimeters thick, 9 millimeters in diameter, and sort of designed to be worn on the thumbnail, right? And can store up to 3 months of data, and then is paired to a smartphone app to collect and display daily UVA and UVB exposure, to offer personalized sun safety coaching tips, and it tracks trends sort of in UV behavior over time. So a lot of wearable sensors are used to creating sort of coach behavior customer experiences. But we want to stress that connected strategies arise both in sort of business to consumer, but also in business to business settings. So for instance, one interesting business to business example is Rolls-Royce's transition from a simple seller of aircraft engines to a much broader service provider enabled by much deeper connectivity. Today's aircraft engines are just basically data generators. So they are packed with sensors and they generate gigabytes of data. Now, this data allows Rolls-Royce to actually have an understanding of individual parts within an engine. Right? So previously, parts such as the fuel pump would be replaced on a fixed schedule, but now Rolls-Royce can replace pumps either earlier or later depending on the state of the pump. Right? And as you can imagine, that creates quite some significant cost savings by being able to use a pump longer than normally. So the ability to deliver these preventable maintenance tests and services has really allowed Rolls-Royce to change its revenue model. So they used to sell engines, And now they're selling flying hours, also called power by the hour, right? And that, of course, sort of really aligns incentives between Rolls-Royce and the customers, which in this case are the airlines, because, right, airlines only want to use and pay for the engines when they really use them. This is, again, a point we'll come back later when we talk about our module on revenue models. Now, Rolls-Royce can use this data in even more ways. So, for instance, by being able to aggregate this data across a customer's entire fleet, Rolls-Royce can gain really further valuable insights. So for instance, a clean engine burns less fuel, but washing engines is costly, right? But using fleet-level data, Rolls-Royce is now able to determine the optimum time for each engine in a fleet to get washed. And even by adding additional data sources, such as technical logs, flight plans, flight forecasts, and actual weather data, Rolls-Royce is now able to provide insights to their airlines of how to increase fuel efficiency, for instance, through improved flight schedules. So through its connected strategy, Rolls-Royce really has been able to increase the value it delivers to its customers, while at the same time increasing its own efficiency. Again, sort of the hallmark of connected strategies, increasing value to customers while reducing cost.